Hey everyone, today I'm going to talk about The Paradise King by Blaine Eldredge. This was recommended by a viewer of the channel, so thank you for recommending this. I would not have known about this otherwise. This was not sent to me for review. I actually purchased a copy because I was so intrigued by it, and I want to tell you what I think about this really remarkable little book. I'll take you through my typical format of the main idea, the research behind it, the readability of its style, and then my general reactions. But the Paradise King, this is the main idea. The Paradise King it's a this is such an interesting book because it's going to be hard to, it doesn't really fit neatly in any category, which is something I really am intrigued by and appreciate about it. But this is a highly creative, highly engaging, almost novelistic telling of the kind of meta-narrative of Scripture, so to speak, the drama, the storyline of the biblical canon. And there's a lot of books over the years, especially, I would say maybe it's 2025 as I record this, about 10-ish or so years ago, seemed like there was this wave of publishing and evangelicalism about the story of Scripture. Lots of good books came out that were kind of trying to recapture Scripture as a narrative, as opposed to discrete little sub-stories. So this is somewhat in that vein of trying to recover the overarching story from Genesis to Revelation of Scripture. But this one sets itself apart primarily in the style, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also in the synthesis of the research. The synthesis of research and style is another unique layer, which I'll talk about again in a minute. But what this does is it goes through the story of Scripture through the figure of kings, six different king figures, starting with Adam. There's a chapter on Abraham, there's a chapter on Moses, there's a chapter on David, there's a chapter on Josiah, and then there's Christ as the sixth kind of kingly figure. And then there's a few chapters that unpack different layers of Christ. So there's not just a single chapter on him. But then there are also these interludes in between each king, particularly in the Old Testament narrative. There's interludes that kind of summarize the sweep of the story from each king to king, kind of fill in the gaps, so to speak. But that's what it is. It tells the storyline of Scripture through these kingly figures with this intentional culmination in the figure of Jesus as the final king. And it's done in a very short, it's really not a long book. The chapters are not very long individually, and it's highly readable, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So that's what the Paradise King, that's the premise. The research behind it, this is one of the things that is surprising about this book. Given the length of it, given the style of it, you wouldn't think about it as primarily a research-driven project. But I was very pleasantly surprised by not just the amount of research in this, but the quality of the research. So Blaine Eldredge, I had no clue who he was before. Was not familiar with him at all. But he pulls on, so there's kind of two layers. In general, it's all well-researched, but there's two primary layers. There's current scholars. He's particularly well-read in kind of current evangelical scholars that are deeply rooted in the Jewish history and background of the Scriptures. So people like Michael Heiser, people like Kenneth Bailey, Stephen DeYoung. These are figures that show up, and a few others that are in that orbit. But if you know who those three are, and you know others that are like them, it's very much that. There's a lot of engagement with those scholars, kind of recovering the deep Jewish history and Jewish roots of the scriptures. But also he does do like primary ancient research. So he reads Josephus, he reads Suetonius. There's a lot of engagement with archaeological work. There's a lot of linguistics engagement with like how certain things are translated and certain terms are used in the stories. And there's pretty developed, there's endnotes and footnotes, and there's pretty developed footnotes throughout the stories that go into some of the linguistic weeds on like, here are the nuances of translation of some of these key terms. I was really impressed by that stuff. I wasn't expecting it at all, given kind of the tenor and the positioning of this book as a super creative telling. It's really shockingly well researched, really wide, really deep, research, especially given kind of the target, kind of the popular level writing and creative writing that's in this. So yeah, really good. And that tees me up to talk about the readability of it. I'm going to linger on the readability point here for a minute, because that's a lot of things make this book unique. I've already said the research is surprising to me, but it's also synthesized with this really unique style, and that style is it's really hard to describe without sounding a little crazy. But I'm a big fantasy fiction reader. I love epic fantasy fiction, science fiction and fantasy, but especially fantasy. I read a lot of that just for fun. Some of these chapters felt like I was reading a chapter from Tad Williams or George Martin or Tolkien. Like, they felt fantastical, in a way that just completely shocked me. I was not expecting that style in this kind of book. But especially the chapter on Adam, but not just that chapter, but like he really weaves in the very spiritual, porous, enchanted worldview of the scripture writers. So obviously Michael Heiser's influence there is significant, but he takes the reality of spirits for granted in the worldview of the scriptural writers, and talks about spiritual adversaries and spiritual enemies and spiritual conflict, and these entities that have positioned themselves against the success of humanity. And it's all couched in this, it does feel like a fantastical kind of style that's super engaging and engrossing, especially if you like that. I mean, like, of course, I love that style anyways. I read that for fun, so I was just like really engrossed by the way he tells these chapters. But it's seasoned with that very deep archaeological and historical research, and the blend is really unlike anything I've ever read. There's no other way to put it. It's just not like anything I've ever read on the topic. Most things that get into the biblical narrative are not nearly as creative. They lean totally on the more of the research, the drier side of things. And this just does both, but it also moves back and forth in a way that's really striking. So what I mean by that is he'll be in the midst of telling the story of Abraham, for example, and his following of this voice that's calling him out of Ur, even the military conflicts that Abraham was engaged in the course of his travels. And so he'll be telling the story, and you'll be really engrossed in the narrative, and then he'll seamlessly go into a paragraph that's explaining the research behind it. So there will be these moments where you're reading a chapter about a figure like David or Moses, and even as someone who's very familiar with the source material, I was reading and I was thinking, is this stuff really, like, is he just making up events now? Like, this seems too fantastical or something. I don't remember this from the scriptures. But then he'll move into a paragraph where he's preempted your questions, and he'll essentially say, this is actually happens, in this part of the scriptures. You can read about it here. Here's why I've decided to tell it in this way. Here's the research behind my decisions to portray it in this way. And then he moves out of that explanatory paragraph, then seamlessly back into the narrative and tells more of the narrative, and then moves back into an explanatory paragraph. It's a really remarkable feat of balancing act of writing styles that synthesizes this research and this really creative flair that's super engrossing. I'm a little bit of a broken record now, but I just haven't read anything like this. There's nothing that I know of that's quite like this, that's out there that accomplishes the same thing. And what he ends up doing through this engaging style is you get the whole sweep of the particularly Old Testament narrative. I mean, you get from Adam through all the major figures leading up to Christ, through the history of Israel and their kings and the monarchy, and then the fall of the kingdom and all of that. And it's just so engaging. It's so engaging and so engrossing. So the readability I thought it was just astoundingly. That's the highest marks for me in terms of my categories, is the readability of this book. And that leads me to my reactions. I've hinted a lot that I really like this book, and I really, really, really like this book a lot, mostly for the style that I already talked about, but secondly, just because of the unique positioning of it. I just can't think of anything else that's like this, and since I've read it, I'm really seriously thinking about using it as a kind of a tool in my church congregation to help walk with people through the biblical story. I think this is probably one of the best, because it's so readable and relatively short, but also so well researched. I think it's one of the best things to walk with people through who may not be big readers or may not consider themselves super informed or whatever, but still would like to just get the story. And I think this has the likely ability to spark people's curiosity to go deeper into things because of that research that he like hints at throughout the telling of the story. And it's just so engrossing. So I strongly suspect this would be a very effective book to use in group studies, in small groups, home groups, whatever, particularly a group of people who'd like to kind of work through the meta-narrative of scriptures altogether, and especially as a springboard to do like kind of deeper dive on any particular chapter, or particular figure, or particular era of history that strikes the reader. So it's just a really, particularly its grasp of the Old Testament story. It does the 3 or 4, I think there's 3 or 4 chapters at the end that just focus on mostly on Christ and then the eschatology, kind of the end of all things. And those are also solid. For me, they weren't quite as like mind-blowingly good as the Old Testament chapters, but they're still really solid, and they still kind of tie everything together in terms of Christ as a typological, eschatological king, Messiah. So they're effective, but I think the book really particularly shines in the reading experience going through the Old Testament story, which is the majority of the book in terms of page count. So anyways, man, this was a book that kind of knocked me over, mostly in the uniqueness of it, the synthesis of that really unique style and blend of research, and kind of the way he guides the reader through how he came to decisions, and the linguistics involved, and the translation issues involved, and the archaeological findings involved, and all of that. It's bound together, and the combination is truly greater than the sum of its parts in this case. And so I hope this book gets a wide audience. I hope it gets recognition. I hope it gets appreciation. I hope it finds a place in, book studies and small groups and churches and even seminaries. Like, I think it's really that interesting and that unique that it deserves a look. And so I really wanted to boost it and feature it here, because I do think that those of you watching probably would be at least intrigued by it, if not outright love it as I do. So that's, those are my thoughts on The Paradise King by Blaine Eldredge. Thanks as always for taking a few minutes to watch.